Hello and happy Halloween. Welcome to Fiction Hack. I'm Colin Monroe.
And I'm Ross Lawhead. Hello.
Hello. Now, Ross, this is the third part of our Halloween special series. We've looked at Universal monsters in the last two episodes. What are we talking about today?
So I'm really excited about this one because when we started this podcast, this was like one of my top 3 ideas that I had in mind for topics that we could cover. This is a lost version of Dracula, which has recently been discovered in Iceland, of all places. And it's if you're interested in Dracula, if you've read the book Dracula, then I definitely recommend checking this out because it really adds something new. And there's a bit of a mystery as to why it even exists and what it actually is. Like, was it written by Bram Stoker or was it written by this other translator? We don't know.
Okay,
but,
so back up
that's
a
what we're
minute.
going to be talking
For
about.
all the ignorant people like me, why is Dracula so special? Or give us some groundwork.
Yeah. So I mean, Dracula in itself is just a really good book for something that was written about 120 years ago. It's just a cracking read, and it really does, I think, live up to the hype. The people who I've recommended it to who haven't read it all come away like completely surprised at how exciting it is and just how much of a page turner it is.
It's quite a short novel, isn't it?
No, not really. I mean, it's kind of mid-sized. Like if any copy is going to be about 350 pages, like that. So it's about. I'd say is probably rough word estimate is about 150,000 words for people who judge by that sort of thing. But otherwise, it's going to be about 300. But the thing is, it is a page turner. Like you will get sucked into it to the point where like the length doesn't even matter, and you're disappointed that it ends. It's told in a really interesting way, which it wasn't like revolutionary at the time because this is a trick that's been done before, but it's still a very effective trick and one that people still use today from time to time. And so it's basically like a collection of letters and journal entries. Sort of told in first person. So the first part of the book is basically this chap who's going to Transylvania to meet with this count who wants to buy property in London, and he's a representative for the company that's going to sell him this property. And so he's writing letters back to his fiancée back in London, and he's telling her about this trip, he's telling her about the count, he's telling her about the strange things that have started to happen and all that. And then when it switches to London, when Dracula comes to London, I'm going to try not to spoil a lot, but this is kind of just generally what happens. People who have seen any movie of Dracula will know that this is kind of generally what happens. Then it switches to a series of either journals or letters, or sometimes it's transcription from wax cylinders when we get to some of the doctors when they enter the story.
So it's almost It's almost like Bram Stoker was trying to create the illusion that it was cobbled together from first-hand research as if it was a true story or something.
Exactly. And like I said, this isn't something that he invented. It was done before by Wilkie Collins for the Moonstone. Not Moonstone. The Woman in White to really good effect. But it does it's telling the story of this count, kind of like an eyewitness account with all of these kind of different journal entries and all these different perspectives on the same figure.
That's a technique that you've actually used in your Color Papers book.
Yeah. Well, that's just like two people talking to each other with letters, two bad poets. So there's not really a storyline beyond kind of what's happening in their own lives. But it is a fun thing to do as a writer. It lets you kind of play different parts, as it were, in the story. You get to enter into characters a little bit more.
I did really enjoy the Color Papers, so I highly recommend everyone goes and reads that.
Oh, I appreciate the plug. I'll put a link in the show notes for where people can buy that. But no, absolutely. So now, okay, not only was that sort of not original technique for Bram Stoker to have done, but that's not actually even an original technique for a vampire story in itself. Right. And although, there weren't many kind of vampire tales before Dracula. There are basically two significant ones. The very first of kind of what we would call the Western, or I think maybe even English or European kind of vampire stories, is apparently, it's a little bit unsure, but it came from the same basically meeting that Frankenstein came out of. So when Mary Shelley was with her fiance, Percy Bysshe Shelley, however you say that name, and Lord Byron in Italy, it was apparently it was like the year without a summer. It had there was some volcano that went off, and it made the summer just kind of wet and dreary and a little bit chilled. And so it was pretty much of a rubbish holiday. And so they all got to thinking or talking, in the evenings, and they had a ghost story competition, like who could kind of have the most frightening tale, and. From that challenge came Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein off the back of that. But then Byron also had an idea of doing something with a vampire, and apparently he had some sort of rough outline, or maybe he sort of gave a presentation one evening, and his doctor, his personal physician that he brought along for the trip, John Polidori, he kind of fleshed this out in a little bit more detail in a publication called The Vampire, which is very short and doesn't. I haven't been able to really kind of find that many places. I've got a source of kind of vampire material, and even then, it kind of just glances over it. The vampire is called Lord Ruthven, and he has very kind of Dracula-like characteristics. And this would have been something which people say that Bram Stoker drew a lot of his inspiration from. It was just basically what we would consider now kind of a plot outline of a vampire story.
Right. So vampires did exist in fiction before Dracula.
Yes,
but Dracula was invented by. It's not a sort of old legendary character. It was created by Bram Stoker.
That's correct. Yeah. So he kind of laid down a lot of the groundwork and kind of created a lot of the rules as well. Kind of how vampires operate, like the garlic kind of thing, and the crucifix thing, and the sunlight and the running water thing, I believe, are all in there.
Because vampires is a sort of. There are links to genuine medical conditions, aren't there?
I guess.
Sort of. Or they have their roots in that. But a lot of it's fiction. A
lot of it is fiction. And, we were talking last episode about, why it's such an interesting myth or why we like it, and the ties to kind of a fear of aristocracy and that kind of deal. And that's very much present in the Bram Stoker ones. In Dracula, he is kind of feeding off of the lower classes essentially, whether he's in London or he's in his own castle, and then that gets developed again in this kind of reclaimed or rediscovered manuscript as well, which we'll get onto in a second.
So is it like in Twilight, where if you get bitten by a vampire, you become a vampire yourself?
No, and even in Twilight. Okay, I'm trying to remember. It's a little bit more complex than that. There has to be some sort of... Well, in Dracula, there's what they call a kind of a blood marriage. So not just anyone becomes one, but one that, Dracula wants to be a vampire will become a vampire.
So there has to be an exchange of blood rather than just...
Yeah, I don't think it's so well illustrated in Dracula, but other... Like, I remember in Buffy the Vampire Slayer is like, well, you have to drink the blood of a vampire in order to become a vampire yourself. Otherwise, you're just a victim. Wait, is that true? No, because she's always having to slay... Oh, I don't know. But in any case, there are... I mean, everybody kind of adds a little bit of a spin on it, I think. And I think you need to with something like this. In any case, I mean, we're just saying that basically, Stoker himself added his own spin when he got his hands on the legend, as it were. There is another important kind of proto-Dracula story, which was written by Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a short story called Carmilla, which I've just read as part of the research for this episode. And that's pretty interesting. So Carmilla, we're saying, was written in... Let's see here. The vampire, by the way, was 1819. The Polidori one. So that's about 80 years before the publication of Dracula. And then we've got Carmilla being published in 1871. So about 15 to 16 years before Dracula again. Again, this is told from a first-person point of view, which is what Dracula is like. The vampire in question, Carmilla, is actually a female vampire.
Okay.
Who kind of manages to get her way into this household and kind of bewitches the narrator of the story, who is also a female. And there is actually kind of overt kind of allusions to sexual attraction between the two of them, which for that time would have been something quite odd. There's nothing really kind of goes anywhere if we're going to talk about that. But there is an idea that this narrator has fallen in love with this vampiric kind of woman who's in their household, and is kind of enslaved in that sense. Which again, if we're throwing that into our mix of aristocracy, I don't think it really fits. It's kind of a different angle on the whole vampire thing. It's probably actually more recognizable currently in what we think of as vampires. And if we look at Twilight or something like that, there's obviously a lot of romance going on in there. Such as there is.
They play off the sort of sexual tensions and.
Yeah, especially when you start getting shirtless werewolves in there and all that kind of thing. So So I think it's important to kind of look at Dracula in terms of those two, because it kind of gives an idea of context. And really, if we're going to talk about this new book that's been discovered, it kind of says, well, what can we kind of subtract from the editions that will give us an idea of what's new and what's original. Because here's the thing. Okay, so Dracula was published in 1897 by Bram Stoker, and the story itself seems to have gone through several significant drafts. And it seems like something he was kind of continually working on. He was actually at that time a theater manager with a slight background in other areas, and this was just going to be something that he was going to write, kind of alongside. He wasn't going to be a career author, and Dracula itself didn't make a lot of money for him in his own lifetime.
Right.
It was also, he saw it as a kind of even a social duty. There's a letter that he wrote. Which says that I'm going to show people the kind of where the path of evil will lead you and all this kind of stuff. So there was a little bit of moralizing, which I think thankfully got edited out of Dracula itself, because there's not a lot of kind of moralizing within it. This bad stuff happens, and then they're able to overcome it, but not through any sort of piousness, but just through working on these kind of laws that Stoker set up with the vampire thing.
So none of that. So he had a sense of duty, but then all of what he felt he needed to achieve, he didn't.
It seems like it, and this is something which is interesting because there is more of that aspect in this new manuscript. So I'll just say like how we've basically come across this before we talk about it in that sense. So you can buy this now, translated into English. It's called Powers of Darkness, the Lost Version of Dracula. It's a very nice edition. It's got a long essay in the beginning, 2 long essays, in fact, and some pretty good footnotes. What's basically happened is that, so we're saying that Dracula was published in 1897, and it was a kind of a moderate success. It wasn't a runaway hit. It wasn't as popular then as it is now, for sure. But for some reason, there was an Icelandic translation that was commissioned for this book, and this person, Valdemar Asmundsson, who was a small literary figure in Iceland, which has had a long history of strong kind of, it's got a strong history of literature itself for the population, which is under a million, and even now the music scene is pretty big for its size, and
Sigur Rós is amazing.
They are, and I saw them live when they're at when they were in Oxford
really?
supporting Radiohead. Yeah, this is years ago.
Cool.
Anyway, getting back to this. So he was a very small literary figure kind of in the scene of Iceland. He ran a newspaper, or sort of literary kind of paper. And he decided he was going to translate this and serialize it in this paper. So he had the rights and all the clearance from Stoker and the publishers to do this. This was all above board, all very official. Mm-hmm. And he did this, and it ran for a little while, and then eventually he died, unfortunately. And his wife collected this serialized story and published it as the Icelandic translation of Dracula. They changed the title to Myrkjana, which means powers of darkness. And although it was badly reviewed at the time, they thought it was, the other Icelandic kind of literary society said it was very vulgar, it was sensationalist, it didn't really add anything to the Icelandic landscape of literature, which I think I would agree. Having read some Icelandic literature myself, this would have been just kind of something that was outside of it. It's not about Iceland. It's not about Icelandic people.
Dracula was originally written in English, right?
Yeah.
And then it was translated into Icelandic. And you're saying that you've read the Icelandic version, but you don't speak Icelandic, do you?
No, well, I do, but not that much. It's been translated back into English from Icelandic. So what we've got is an Icelandic translation of Dracula that's been translated back into English. And it's been published. It's called Powers of Darkness. And this is the edition that you can get with the essays in and that kind of thing. Now, it's been done like this because there are that many significant differences between the Icelandic version and the English version that it raises a whole lot of questions about what actually has gone on here. Although the book itself is shorter than Dracula, the beginning is very different, and it's actually about 50% longer than the first part of Dracula. So remember, I was telling you the plot of Dracula has got this man who goes to visit the Count, and he's writing letters back to his fiancée.
Yeah.
Now that part is interesting to look at because there are 100 pages from the English version that are missing. So the one that was published 100 years ago, they know that there are 100 pages missing. So they've basically found the typewritten manuscript, and it starts on page 105 or whatever. There's a jump in there.
Well, so those are lost. If you buy a copy now,
exactly,
it's incomplete. Nobody knows what that says.
No, those weren't intended to be published. So Stoker had gone. This is what I'm saying. He's gone through a bunch of different revisions, and I've done this as well. Cut out a whole chunk of the story. It's holding up the beginning of the story. You want to get into the rest of it. Maybe it's boring. Maybe it doesn't really fit. So at some point, those were taken out, and we don't know what's happened to those. There was a short story published in 1914 called Dracula's Guest, which has more information on that. It has, the same character, Jonathan Harker. He hasn't met the Count yet, but he's fallen in some trouble with some wolves, and then Dracula sends some help to him in order to get this guy to his castle, essentially. So, but even with that, that's maybe about 35 pages of what would have been lost. And so there's still, this X amount of pages from the start of the story, which no one really knows what that would have contained. Bram Stoker has left notes, kind of his working journal, or manuscripts with ideas about characters, ideas about plots, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of speculation on what that could have contained, but nobody knows for sure. And now people have realized that, wait a second, there's this Icelandic book of this translation of Dracula that's got a longer first section and a kind of retold section, and then it's got the second part of the book, but it's told in a very strange way, almost like it's like the second part are just translated plot sheet itself. There's absolutely no dialogue in it. Nobody talks in that. Everybody says, so and so goes and meets with so and so, and they discuss this. Then so and so goes and meets so and so, and then this happens. So it's almost like a plot breakdown of the last half of Dracula, and then you've got this expanded first section with a lot of dialogue and some very significantly changed plot points.
So it sounds like he's translated from a very early draft.
Exactly. However, we can't be sure. Because apparently this guy, was a writer himself, and people are saying that it's not actually past his capabilities to have invented this himself. This is a person, he's not just a translator, he's a writer himself. Yeah. He's just happened to translate this other book. So people are saying, well, did this guy actually embellish and kind of change things and add his own ideas in, under the impression that maybe he was, collaborating on this and somehow, or maybe he wanted to make it kind of relevant to Icelandic culture.
But it was published as a translation of Dracula.
Yes. It was actually even published with a preface written by Bram Stoker, which people have known about for a little while. But it doesn't really give any more kind of clarity on the situation, because the thing is that Bram Stoker wouldn't have read the translation once it was translated, because he wouldn't have, read it Icelandic.
Yeah,
exactly. So it's kind of... There are a lot of kind of dead ends, dead leads in the story. Although, I've read it myself. My gut feeling is that it is an early draft of Dracula that somehow this guy has gotten his hands on. And the thing is that that's a mystery in itself, because, I haven't had any of my books translated into other languages, but my dad has had a lot of his books translated. And you always work from the official manuscript itself, so you never work
but that's
from
nowadays
notes.
It could have been very different 100 years ago.
I guess the thing is that he was translating it as it was being published, so it is possible. But there's the other thing, is like, who would have given... Okay, someone comes to your office, your publishing office 100 years ago, and says, hey, I want to translate one of your books into Icelandic. Well, what you do is you say, okay, here's the book, translate it. Or you say, well, wait a couple years, we haven't finished the book yet, then you can, translate it once we give you this.
And Dracula was originally published all in one go, right? It wasn't serialized yet.
Yes, no, that's an important point. And yes, that's exactly true. What you don't do is say, sure, you can translate it. Here's an early draft, here's an early incomplete draft of the manuscript. Go ahead and start with that. We'll give you the rest of the book later. That seems insane, but that seems to be what has happened. That's the only thing I can think has happened, because the characters. There's a new character in this first book, which is basically a kind of maid. In the book Dracula lives with no servants at all. But in this new, the Powers of Darkness one, the one that's been retranslated from Icelandic back into English, there is this old sort of deaf and dumb maid who's going around the castle kind of, serving meals and tidying up a little bit. That's not in Dracula, but it is in Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula as a character that he wants to write. Which is interesting. There are other things about the way that Dracula behaves once he gets back to London. And again, this is in an abridged version, apparently, in the Powers of Darkness book, and it's not in Dracula. But in his notes, Stoker says, that he should meet with other kind of high London society figures, and that's what happens in this kind of abridged second half, is that Dracula actually wants to take over the world, he says, and he has some meetings with some, which are told in the story as prominent London figures. He doesn't actually name any names or anything like that. So there are these little clues that it would be too much of a coincidence for this Icelandic translator to add in this stuff without any real reason. And then to have it kind of tally up with what is in Bram Stoker's notes as to an early idea that he had for this Dracula book that he's planning.
Yeah, it's too much of a coincidence. It's too much
of a coincidence.
Yeah.
And even the title Dracula itself was kind of a late decision by Stoker.
Right, yeah.
It was only kind of the year before, or it's kind of only the last revision that he decided that he was going to actually call it Dracula. So even the fact that the Icelandic version isn't called Dracula would even support the idea that this was an early draft by Stoker that got published under a slightly different name. Now, the translator, this guy, Hans de Roos, he seems to be be more on the fence with the entire.
So this is the guy translating it back to
English. The guy translating it back into English.
Right.
He's kind of more on the fence with all of it, and seems to credit the translator with a lot of the additions, and he draws attention to those in this translation that he's made. Those are all kind of textual, and they're all most of the kind of what he calls kind of the Icelandic perspective on the story are more kind of illustrations or allusions to Icelandic myths and sagas that are kind of by the way. It's kind of like, this was done such as it was done in Odin's time and that kind of stuff. So they're not really significant. They don't really change the characters. They don't change the story in the way that some of these other larger pieces that do change the story, do change the characters, tally up with Stoker's early plans for the book. We find out a lot more about Dracula and his kind of philosophy on life and death, and even more of his history, as well as a possible origin for why Dracula is the way he is, which is not in the Dracula book itself, but in this new Powers of Darkness edition, there is a kind of idea of he fell in love with this countess, which actually kind of tallies up a bit with Carmilla's story, because we got a female vampire who is a countess there as well. He's kind of, this Dracula guy has fallen in love, and I won't again spoil it, but there's this kind of, he tells the story of one of his ancestors, which as it goes on, you get the feeling that it might actually be himself that he's talking about, just with all the details that he knows about. So even there, it's still masterfully written, even though it is kind of ostensibly an early draft, and it does have some of those chilling kind of elements into it. It looks like a possible explanation for why this is not in Dracula is that he kind of got in too deep with the whole lore of Dracula and the emotion behind it, that he started to go down this route that he wasn't willing to commit to. He wanted to tell this moral story, but he got too deep into this whole kind of psychology of evil and what it means to be evil and to be, consider yourself a child of the devil rather than God. That was kind of not what he was setting out to do. And so it looks like the revisions, the subsequent revisions, were all intended to really dial back on that and to push that into the background a little bit, let people infer from the actions rather than have things be explained to them. Another one of my favorite bits, and again, this isn't really spoiling too much because we all kind of know this from Dracula because it's in the 1930s movies. It's it's in all the other kind of movie versions of Dracula. Is that Dracula isn't alone in his castle. He does have these three women, they're sometimes called the Weird Sisters, but they kind of appear to Jonathan Harker and try to kind of entice him into some sort of corruption, some sort of carnal corruption, and with the intent of actually feeding on him. And there's not really any explanation given to why there are these three female vampires in the castle with Dracula, why he wants to have these people around, why they're there. In this new edition,
so, hey,
this rediscovered edition.
Is that what inspired Terry Pratchett? Because he wrote a book called Weird Sisters, didn't he?
He wrote a book called Weird Sisters. People refer to him as that. The Weird Sisters that the people are borrowing from, and what Terry Pratchett is actually going off the back of is Macbeth. The Weird Sisters are the three witches.
Right. Yeah.
Weird is we use that differently now. Back in that time, it was used in the Old English sense of fate. So you're weird, W-Y-R-D is the Old English form of that word, and that means fate. So these are the fateful sisters.
So
they're
the
sisters.
They're the sisters
Exactly. They're the ones who tell Macbeth his fate. They know what's going to happen. But they are very strange, and so that's why we call the weird now means strange rather than fate, which I think is an interesting little kind of etymological footnote. Yeah. But in any case, so Dracula is living with these three female characters, and there's no explanation given why. In this new rediscovered, possibly early manuscript, there's a really interesting aside that Jonathan Harker finds out when he's in the village they say, oh yeah, the Count, yeah, he lives up on that up on that hill in that castle. He's a really tragic figure. He's been married 3 times and he's outlived all of his wives. And when I read that, it just sent chills down my spine, because it's like, these are his wives. These are people who he's married, who have died, who he's turned into vampires just through the course of his long life. And that's why they're trapped in that castle. That's why he keeps them around. That's why they're not brought over to England. You know, he's going to start afresh in a different country.
Right.
And so again, that's another little element of horror.
Is he immortal like vampires are?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, under the certain conditions, you know, that vampires are allowed to continue living. Yeah, he has been alive for hundreds and hundreds of years.
So hang on, but they are not alive? I mean,
no, they are.
The Weird Sisters?
Yeah, in the same way that, I mean, they're undead.
So when this person says they're not, he's outlived them, they're undead. So, but they're not zombies. I mean,
but no,
zombies then?
No, let's back up, Colin. Back up. So this guy doesn't know. This is just what people say about the Count.
Okay, so they're in the castle, but we don't know that. Right.
But see, that guy doesn't even know that these people are still around. This is just someone in the village who's saying this. You know, this isn't Bram Stoker who's saying this. Yep. This is just someone who's saying, oh yeah, the Count, yeah, this is the general knowledge about him, is that he's a tragic figure. He's outlived these 3 wives, and he's up there alone right now. Well, he's not alone. They are still around, you know, these 3 wives, living this kind of half shadow life of a vampire. There's also a sacrifice scene. Dracula is there. He kills one of the villagers, and there are these kind of ape-like beasts that he does this in front of. There's all these kind of different elements that have been added to this story. So the front end of the book is really a lot more dramatic than the front part of Dracula. And again, maybe that's another reason why a lot of this was kind of edited out, because instead of it building and building to its eventual climax as we see in Dracula, it may have been felt that there was way too much action, way too much excitement at the beginning of the book, and then once he got to London, well, then not really a lot happens. So in lieu of kind of sacrificing that second half of the book, he decided to really tone down the first part of the book. And it's really fascinating to think that, you know, that more racy beginning exists now in this new version that's been rediscovered. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I'll say anything more than that. To say anything more would really kind of really run the risk of spoiling it for anyone who does want to read it. If you want, I'll put all information in the show notes on the Fiction Hack website. If you want to find out more about this.
Fiction-hack.com.
Fiction-hack.com. And so definitely check it out if you're all interested. I think it's a great read, not just for October, but for any time as well. And I'll just finish by saying that do read the extra material. It's basically kind of a special edition, you know, DVD book if you do buy that edition that I have, the Overlook Duckworth book, because there is a kind of open question about there might be a continuation of the story, because, well, for 2 reasons. The one that's mentioned in the book is that it's been known for a while that there's a Hungarian edition of the book that has not been translated into English. Maybe that's got something different in it as well. Maybe it's got, you know, maybe it's the same story as the Icelandic one. Maybe it's a different story. In any case, it's worth definitely taking a look at that. So a 100-year-old Hungarian edition of the book. And there's also apparently Bram Stoker's grandson, Dr. Stoker. He's written another book that's kind of expands the idea, but he's going to release another book. I don't know if it's been released yet. I haven't found any information on it online, but he's apparently going off of his grandfather's notes, and he's writing a prequel to Dracula as well. So maybe there's something in there that will also support all of this. We don't know, but it's I think it's fascinating. There's actually, you know, there's a big kind of subculture of Dracula. Really kind of academia and scholarly interest. There's a book that the book which I've been going through, which has got a lot of this information about early vampires that I've been mentioning in this podcast is called A Clutch of Vampires by Raymond McNally, and that was published in the 70s, I believe. And this was someone who was a professor himself, but then decided that he was going to really get into this Dracula thing and make a kind of hobby of it. So he traveled around Transylvania, tried to find the original castle, which I don't think really exists because I don't think Stoker really traveled around there. But he treated it as a historical subject and said, well, what can we find other historical sources of vampires, and what essays can we write, and what other else can we pull into this build a mythos over it.
Why do you think that Dracula has become so important in everyone's heard of Dracula?
Yes.
What is there something special about it at the time that caused that, or did it just get lucky in getting it made into a movie, and then I don't know, you know what I mean?
I mean, as much as I want to, because I started this off by saying that it's a really good book, and people should read it in itself. That's not the reason why we remember it today, unfortunately. As much as I want that to be the case, it's not. It was kind of continually in print, and it, as I mentioned in the first of the Universal pictures, it did have kind of stage productions and stuff. Those were all kind of off the back of the Nosferatu movie. Which again, we could have a whole nother podcast just kind of on Dracula itself. I will wrap that up
as a character, just that
as a character, as a concept. We could, all the movies that have been done about him, all the books that have been written about him afterwards. But yeah, the book itself didn't make money for Stoker. He did, die, next to penniless.
That doesn't mean it's not any good. It just means it wasn't discovered in his time.
Exactly. In the 20s.
But because I was thinking just then about, our episode on truth and story and how we were talking about what is it that actually makes a good story, and it's that, that it speaks a deeper truth. So, what is the deeper truth of Dracula, or is there a deeper truth that makes it that is the reason it's done so well over so many years?
I think thematically it's quite rich, and so I think this is why a lot of people want to have their turn at telling a vampire story, because the idea in itself has a lot of implications that are just really interesting to play out in a kind of fictional way of, just someone who lives a long time. For some reason, romance just keeps getting thrown in there. I've never really found out why that is appealing so much, but apparently the whole biting on the neck thing is something that really, gets to people.
It's quite erotic.
I guess. I don't know. It doesn't do anything for me, but, each to his own, I suppose. So there is a lot to play with, in creative terms. Dracula itself is a cracking read, like I keep saying. It kind of was just underneath the surface until the 1920s. And this German silent movie, Nosferatu, was made by F.W. Murnau. If I showed you a screen image of it, you'd recognize it instantly. It's the kind of hunched figure with the pointy ears and the pointed teeth.
Half hiding behind a cloak kind of thing.
Exactly, that sort of thing. This was done as... It was quite cheeky. It is the story of Dracula. It does have someone going to the Carpathian Mountains to meet with this weird Count Orloff, I think it is, who then comes to Britain and starts feeding off of people and stuff. It's because it's a silent movie, you don't have any dialogue, and it's probably about 70 minutes in total. I've seen it a few times myself. Again, if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's worth seeing because it is quite chilling in a lot of senses. It holds up in some areas. In some areas, it doesn't. It's not the best acted silent movie even for its time, but just that central figure is so odd looking. And we were talking about German Expressionism. This is a carry on from that. I'm not sure it's officially an Expressionist movie, but it does have a lot of the sensibilities, especially in terms of lighting and the chiaroscuric effect that it's trying to generate. There's a lot done with shadows, a lot done with kind of inferred motion rather than things that you actually see on the screen.
That's interesting.
But it's a ripoff basically of Dracula. And Bram Stoker's widow did take the company that made the movie to court in a few very lengthy legal battles, which eventually ruined the movie company. It didn't ruin the career of the director, but it did kind of bankrupt the the company that had put this out. And that drew a lot of public attention to the story of Dracula itself, to the book of Dracula, because it was in the papers. It was a very kind of high-profile case. And then people started reading it from that. And then just a short time later, we're talking, if that was 22, I think it was, the Nosferatu movie, and then you had the legal battles. And then in 1931, you've got the Universal Bela Lugosi Dracula talking movie coming up, the official movie, which unfortunately for Bram Stoker's widow, just the way that copyrights were handled back then, it's not like today, where today if you write something, it's international copyright law, you own that. Back in the 1800s, late 1800s, you had, in America at least, you had to file with a copyright board or company to say, I have done this, here it is, it's got my copyright on it. Unfortunately, Bram Stoker was just under the deadline for doing that for the US market. So technically, it turned out in the United States, Dracula was in the public domain, even while Bram Stoker was alive. That means that anyone could do whatever they wanted with it. So by the time Dracula came around in the 30s, Universal found this out, and so they didn't have to pay a penny, at least in the United States, to Bram Stoker's estate. And I think that also probably gave another boost to Dracula itself, because then anyone could do something with Dracula in America, at least, and really kind of develop the idea. And then that just sent people back to the original source of Dracula, the book. And
so that
a lot of people realized,
lifetime.
like with me. No, it wasn't, because he died. Like I said, he died pretty short after. So it wasn't in his lifetime that he saw the Talking Dracula movie. I'm not even sure his widow was still alive at that time.
Right. Yeah.
But he didn't even see the silent movie either. So that all happened after his death. But anyway, so that's just a little bit of this is the surface of kind of what Dracula is, and like I say, it's all in support of me really recommending that people go out and look up this Powers of Darkness book, because as much as Dracula is a really good read that first for sure, but then also try to find this maybe in your library or buy it on Amazon, because it really adds a whole nother dimension to the figure of Dracula.
So you can put a link in the show notes, and let us know what you think. If you've got any opinions yourself, obviously, use the hashtag on Twitter, FictionHack. We'd love to know what you're thinking. Yeah,
if you've read the manuscript, you've got a different opinion, absolutely let us know. I'll be interested to have a discussion with anyone who's got any sort of other perspective on it.
Okay, and obviously people can follow you on Twitter at Ross Lawhead.
Yep, at Ross Lawhead, all one, and they can follow you on Twitter at Colin_Munro.
That's MUNRO, the proper Scottish way.
Exactly. We've already mentioned the website. Go check that out. It's got the show notes in it. And recommend us to a friend. Just sort of pass it on and say, hey, you should listen to this. This is kind of cool. If you think it's cool. If not, keep it to yourself maybe.
Other podcasts I listen to say you should write a review or leave a rating, something like that. So if that's an option, wherever you're listening, however you're listening, that would be cool too.
Yeah, like us on YouTube or star us on iTunes or
I don't think we've ever mentioned the YouTube now. The YouTube's up and running.
That's right, we can let the cat out of the bag. So you've gone back and you've put past episodes up on YouTube, and we'll be putting the new ones up every week as well. So,
there'll be a bit of a delay with the YouTube one, so I think the podcast, whether you're listening on SoundCloud or wherever, will always be the most up-to-date thing. So you should subscribe
if you want to get the episodes as soon as they happen, definitely go on SoundCloud. There's an app you can get, and you can just kind of subscribe to us.
Any podcast player should have it eventually. Maybe not right yet, but it's still early days. Still figuring all that out.
Okay, bye everyone. See you next week. Be excellent to each other.
I do wish we could chat for longer, but I'm having an old friend for dinner. Bye. careful. We're trying to record a podcast. There's no time for that.
I don't know where my head is. All right.
Okay, should we just go into it then?
Yeah.
Now, it's Halloween week, so I need to be spooky or something.
Yeah. If you can. If it's within your range.
Yes. I was thinking of trying to find some different music or something, but I couldn't find anything as good.
That's fine.